So anyway, I wanted to show you, there's a lot in this packet that I don't think we're going to have time to digest. I wanted to, and I'll come back to the academic sentence starters and all of that. At the very back of your packet, there are 2 sets of questions. And I don't know how, I mean, you are the experts in terms of what writers coaches can do to interface with teachers. But I was sort of thinking about my own experience working with writers coaches and my learning curve. And I think that by asking thoughtful questions of teachers in advance, especially the site coordinators, we can build sort of an expectation from teachers that they need to provide us with quality materials to support their students. And so I wanted to point to you, and I'm sure you have other questions that you might want to ask them as well. But I think, you know, sometimes a gentle email just saying, do you have a rubric you're going to provide us? How about some sentence frames for supporting English language learners in your writing? Can we have a copy of the text students are using to base their writing on? I also think one of the big ahas for me, and Mark has worked with me, so he can test that sometimes it was like, hi, I have writers coaches scheduled and I don't have a piece of writing. They're just starting their research report. Well, sometimes my instinct was to just send the kids to the coaches to talk. But I think if we're going to do that, if we're going to engage the students in a pre-writing activity, the teacher had better provide a discussion guide that allows, that's sort of a guide of how to focus that conversation with the coach. And I would say it's the student's responsibility to take notes on that form and just say, if you're going to do a pre-writing activity, can you please provide us with a discussion guide? And expect your students to take notes off of it. Otherwise, sometimes students come back and they say, I don't remember what they said. I don't know if that's been your experience. Can you guys just comment on that a little bit? Or what's your experience been with teachers? Yeah.
When we do a pre-writing activity, we are supposed to, in the course of the session, get their thoughts down and form up a thesis and a general outline and see how far along the process we can get them. So that, and they do leave with a sheet with their everything written out. So
right.
They should have a record and a real strong starting point.
So I've seen those forms as well, but as a teacher, what I noticed was that I think that's great to have the writer's coach write that, but I really think it should be on the student to practice listening and then taking notes. Otherwise, you have children who will say, I can't read their handwriting, or they, you know, there's just, I think that putting the pressure on the child to be held accountable for the coaching session is okay. I think that's a great tool. I mean, especially with some students who can't write and talk at the same time. I'm not very good at that. I think it's beautiful to have the coach support them in that way. I just would suggest that we also ask teachers to provide some form of accountability for their students as well. That's just my 2 cents. Yeah.
I'm generally getting that from my teachers.
Great. That's what I wanted to know is, how many of you feel like you have teachers that will do that, that provide some pre-writing?
What you mean actually by discussion, right? Are you, I mean, Laura was talking, I think, about the outlines, the pre-write things. Is that what you mean there?
Well, I'm trying to think back. I know, Mark, you have so many teachers. I remember doing a research report where my students had index cards. They just had notes. They weren't even at the outlining stage yet, but they were scheduled to meet with the writers' coaches. And so I wanted to prompt my students to have a conversation with the coaches where the coaches could really try to find the gaps in what the kids hadn't already researched. And so in order to do that, I sort of created some questions, which were like questions on like, which topics do you still need more information on? Which topic needs more evidence to be supported? It was that kind of thing. So it may not be necessary for your teachers. Maybe they're already doing it. That's great. I'm just suggesting that as maybe something to think about in the future. And I'm suggesting that in a totally humble way. It's not a priority for me necessarily.
Can I see a show of hands again? How many people think you're getting all this from your teachers? Because I would like to have copies of a lot of them.
My teachers do that.
Great. 2 out of 3. Okay, great.
Okay.
Awesome.
Okay. Thank you.
That always makes me happy to hear. And then, you know, questions that reflect a little bit more of the sort of Common Core paradigm. These are questions that coaches can ask students. And I don't know if this would be useful or not. This was sort of a brainstorm on my end also. But it says deepening students' understanding of their own argument. And these are just some question frames that might help students think critically about their own writing. So things like, and the getting at nuance piece is really tricky, especially with students who are not fluent writers or might be English language learners. The using of qualifiers and superlatives, getting a sense of often, usually, sometimes, may be true, would be true. A lot of my students just write as if it's always true. And so to the extent that we can get our coaches to ask them, well, are there situations where that might not be the case? Is there a way we can write about that so it's more balanced? I think that can improve their writing. Also, things like show me a place in the text that was an aha moment for you as a way to enter into conversation. It's just some ideas, okay? Okay, great. I'm glad that's useful. I wanted to talk a little bit about academic language and what's meant by that. There's academic vocabulary, and when we talk about academic vocabulary, especially with teachers who've been trained in constructing meaning, we talk about brick and mortar words. And teachers should be teaching their students these things explicitly with actual classroom instruction. Brick words are content-specific vocabulary. So if you're writing about the Civil War, it would be vocabulary about the Civil War. But mortar words are these general sentence frames that help students write academically. And I think it's really important because no child in 8th grade usually walks into the classroom fluent in academic standard English. That's a written discourse. And so the idea that all children can benefit from these sentence frames and these ways of putting a construct in their minds to start their thinking, eventually they can let go of them. They're sort of like training wheels, they get internalized. But you'll see a couple of pages in your packet. The academic language for annotating text is one. There's another page that says, sorry, I'm flipping. Academic sentence starters for response to lit. So things like, when the protagonist decides to blank, it makes the reader realize that. Or, although blank does not come right out and say it, one can infer that. That kind of language is not going to come comfortably to an 8th grader. But it's powerful language, and once they really understand what it means, it's going to get them at deeper analysis, which is something that we all struggle with when we're teaching writing. You know, it's easier to teach the formula of put a quote in a paragraph, explain what it means. But to teach the language that builds that is something that we're realizing really students do benefit from it explicitly taught. Doesn't mean that they shouldn't be reading widely to acquire a vocabulary. All of that is also good teaching. It's just this new strategy that we've been kind of messing with for quite a bit. And so most of the time when my students have writing assignments, they also have a toolkit that they've been using for persuasion or for response to lit.
So Aryn,
Yeah?
You've worked with writer coaches.
Mm-hmm.
So how much of this would you expect to come, let's say
Yeah.
specifically, from the teacher versus something that we could or should share with our coaches in order to have them back it up? It's sometimes, I don't want to have us teaching new material.
Of course not, right.
So that,
Yeah.
so I guess that, how are you envisioning this happening in coaching session? Would you say that maybe the teacher would give us?
I would hope so.
Okay.
I would hope that would be something that a teacher would provide to
Okay.
you. I don't think it's the coach's job to teach academic vocabulary. And also, you cannot throw a packet like this at a child and expect them to use it. That's something that takes time. So, if I'm doing a persuasion unit and my students are doing 3 or 4 pieces of persuasive writing, they are using the same kit over and over again. We have daily practice with it. However, it is helpful if you do see one of these sort of things come across a coach, is to prompt the coach to ask, let's look at the places in your writing that would have benefited from some of those sentence frames that your teacher gave. Or it might be useful to provide 1 or 2 sentence frames to a coach. I mean, I don't know. You actually are the experts when it comes to what writers coaches can do with students versus they can. I'm not actually sure of the answer to that question.
But
What do other people think?
It has to start with the teacher.
I think it absolutely has to start with the teacher.
Do all the teachers, BUSD teachers have this page?
All of my middle school teachers do,
What
yes.
about high school teachers?
They all were trained in constructing meaning, which has a lot of these types of academic sentence frames. So I am pretty sure, especially in the 9th grade, that BHS teachers have something along these lines.
Would it be a good idea to say, I learned this in the class, for your own personal edification? Would this be helpful?
Yeah,
Okay.
yeah, absolutely.
Scan it.
Totally. I may have even sent them to Tamara, who's one of the people who's facilitating their PD. Yeah.
Also it occurred to me that we could incorporate this in our shortcuts packet, that we have the handouts for coaches to give their students. So if they're having trouble with constructing, how to introduce a code and that kind of thing. some of these could be included.
We have shortcuts already that are related to argumentative essay.
Yeah, but I mean, you
Well,
say
we're
it's
gonna-
separate,
some of that
We're
would
gonna
be
spiff
great.
them up.
Yes,
For sure,
yes.
we're gonna do that, yes.
That's great.
And I just want to say that both of the ELD teachers that I work with, both in Berkeley and El Cerrito, provide us with sentence frames specific to the assignment.
Great.
Very helpful.
Yeah.
Very helpful.
Yeah, and I think, like you said, it's different with different teachers. Different teachers do different things. So it may be something where prompting teachers who've never tried it before or sharing a material that they haven't seen before might be useful. I don't know if that's a good role I don't know what the experience of the site coordinators are with having that kind of dialogue with teachers, so I'm very humble about suggesting that. I don't know. Yeah.
Aryn, can you talk a little bit more about how we know that these help students? You said, specifically like imposing academic language. How does that what's been found helpful?
Well, okay, I can only.
How has that been found helpful?
I have not actually. I just read an article by Krashen actually about vocabulary acquisition. I read it yesterday, and the reason I read it was because I wanted to know about SSR specifically, and how useful SSR was to helping English language learners acquire new vocabulary. Sustained silent reading. I'm sorry.
Yep.
And it was an interesting conversation because there was some debate for a while about what the best way to help students acquire vocabulary was. And Krashen is the guy who basically said free reading, free unstructured silent reading will help students subliminally acquire vocabulary. And he's still adamant that this is the best way to go. And there were some people who said, but what about your English language learners? Is this a situation where the rich get richer? Because if you're already a fluent reader, you can grab on to new phrases more quickly. And I don't actually know that there's an answer to that question. I do know that from my own personal experience using these, what was exciting to see was when students started to use it in their conversation, in their Socratic seminars, and in their writing unprompted. So it is like training wheels, and you will see them use them horribly and wrong, and you're shocked by like, wow, you can't say one can interpret that to mean when that's not actually an interpretation, But at the same time, before I was doing that, I was getting really short sentences that were all starting with the, or, so my experience has been that there are students who this just bumps up the quality of the thinking that's in their writing, and they're able to articulate more complicated thoughts. I'm not sure it's the only way to do it. I also still think that wide reading of a variety of genres, consistent reading all the time is also one way that students acquire this kind of vocabulary. But students don't read a lot of informational text all the time, and especially not in their free time. So they're not going to come across this kind of material unless it's in a textbook or in these higher level high school and college courses. And I think the argument is you don't want to wait that long.
Yeah, I was just thinking in terms of that, of when we talk to our coaches,
Yeah.
how we explain to them, because they'll look at this and go,
Yes.
oh, but kids don't talk this way. So-
No one
so
talks
then
this
we can-
way.
Right, no, but then, then we can say,
Right.
this is the theory
No, that's
behind
a good
this is
question.
da-da-da,
Yes.
and.
I
Right.
can also say as a college teacher, I mean,
Yeah.
you want students coming with this kind of background. We get them as first-year students, and we're starting from scratch. They have no idea what we're talking about in terms of academic language.
So you want to introduce it?
You want to introduce it as soon as possible. I always tell students we have 45 hours, and to try to cover all of this and to train them, in that kind of language or writing fluency, which is what we think about. So this is great to see it starting so early. I have to say, in other parts of the country, they are doing some of this, and some of this we even call writing across the curriculum.
Yes.
That's been a big wave in the Midwest.
Mm-hmm.
So it's this is the best way to prepare them. It really is.
Yeah.